country, you have to do this.
How are you? Hi.
Hello. Can I get over? It's very important.
Now, what would you do with an audience of 200 people?
Well, this is very intimate, see?
Get there early.
Yeah. When you have an intimate setting like this, it's a little different. The 200 I have to cancel out. I'm sorry. I guess the subject is music. And, music has been my life for so many years, but I guess the only way I could really describe what my life is about in music, what music means to me, what I play, what I compose, I'd have to talk about my mother and father, because this is extremely important. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and at that time, you know, America was a city of segregation. It was a country of segregation. So within the black community, which in a way was contained, we had some of the most fantastic music and dance in all areas of music. We had the black church, we had the blues clubs, we had the calypso, we had the Palladium with the Latin bands. And should I continue?
No, we're good.
And it was very rich. And every day I'm very grateful to my mother and father and that particular generation. And the reason why I emphasize them is because they listened and they brought all kinds of music into the house. There was no such thing as one particular category. My father might bring in an Ellington, he might bring in a Ma Rainey, it could be a Marian Anderson, it could be some music from Jamaica, some calypso music. And it could be the black church, it was just wonderful. So we grew up listening to all kinds of music, and it was all considered today African American music, black music, but it was our culture and our way of life. And there was no separation between the musicians and the people, because they knew whether you played well or not. It was very simple. I would practice my lessons on the piano, and my father who was not a musician, but he knew right away if I was hit a wrong note. Something very intuitive about music. And I grew up in the area where Max Roach lived about 3 or 4 blocks away. Cecil Payne's father had a tailor shop. My father had a barber shop. We shared the same toilet, just like that. And we used to discuss music. Ernie Henry, Duke Jordan, and not to also mention all the great musicians that were in Harlem. In Greenwich Village, we had people like Willard the Lion Smith. We had Lucky Roberts, had a fantastic club up in Harlem. These are my really great pianists. U.B. Blake lived about 10 blocks away. I used to go by U.B.'s house when he was about 90 years old, and he would tell stories about the ragtime piano and the history of the piano. So I just want to describe this area of New York and why New York is so important, because all the great musicians came from New York, and that was like the testing ground. You could be great in California, you could be great in Chicago, you could be great in Biloxi, Mississippi, you could be great anywhere, but you have to come to New York to sort of prove yourself. So being from New York, I was blessed because by being in New York, we had access to all the great musicians. So I had an opportunity to go to 52nd Street and hear Art Tatum and hear Earl Gardner and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and on and on and on. So I just want to describe this rich, wonderful scene of music from Harlem to Brooklyn in New York City. And of course, at that time, there was no television, there was no video, there was no disco. So we not only listened to the music, most of the music was for dancing. We would go to dances and hear Billy Eckstine's big band. We go to dances to hear Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. We go to dances and hear Charlie Parker play, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because the way it was arranged in a very wonderful way. Because the thing about our history of music, the rules are kind of mystical. They're not so clear that you can say da 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 da. There's a lot of mystery, a lot of magic, a lot of phenomenal things that have happened in the music. But in essence, in the Savoy Ballroom, at that particular time, they would have the best dancers. So if an Ellington came to the Savoy Ballroom, or a Count Basie came to the Savoy Ballroom, or some of the great ballrooms in New York, the dancers would create a new dance to go with the new music. Because with African American people, there was never a separation between dance and music. And this is certainly true in Africa. You don't separate the two. But I think the separation happened after the Second World War when they put a 20% tax on places of dance. And what happened, our music became more of a listening music. And at a certain point, people say you can't dance to jazz. Jazz is a music for listening. But nothing could be further from the truth. Those older ragtime pianists like James B. Johnson and Fats Waller and U.B. Blake and Lucky Roberts, those masters who I adore, who I listen to almost every day. To me, their music is not old-fashioned, it's not outdated. For me, from Louis Armstrong up until now, it's simply just music of the 20th century. And for me, their music was modern. For me, Louis Armstrong was a modern trumpet player, and he's also traditional. And from them, all of us today, we're using a little bit of Duke, there's a little bit of Monk, there's a little bit of Dizzy, there's a little bit of Louis Armstrong, there's a little bit of Billie Holiday in all of us, because they are I call them our royalty. When I heard Art Tatum, I just got 2 CDs of Art Tatum playing in someone's home, and his piano is just unbelievable. And you know this music has no time capsule. So in essence, what I'm saying is this, that for me is 20th century music. So when I listen to 1927 Ellington, and when I hear the Ellington Jungle Band, I'm hearing modern music. I'm hearing music that was different, that's fresh, creative, and exciting. So in all my music, I try to use the elements of our very beginners of this music up until today. Now, I had a very fiery father. My dad was born in Panama. He was from Jamaica. And he was a great follower of Marcus Garvey, whose philosophy was for our people to go back to Africa and to restore Africa and rebuild Africa. We were taken away by, not that we wanted to leave Africa, we were taken away in slavery. And his message was that one day we'd have to go back to help to rebuild our continent that is so rich in so many things. Rich in music, rich in history, rich in archaeology, rich in, you name it. The first real beginning of civilization as we know it began in Africa. So my dad was very strong about this. And growing up as a boy in Brooklyn, New York, in my house, there were many maps of ancient African kingdoms. He had books written by African Americans, and he created an African atmosphere, which was it was complete opposite of what I was experiencing in the public school and in the Hollywood cinema, when they would portray a Tarzan, for example, as the strongest man in Africa, as the Africans were slaves, as they had no civilization before the Europeans came, before the Arabs came, and this sort of propaganda. So I was always in between the two. But at the same time, as a boy, I would go to the libraries, and I used to read books about Africa. And I would dream, I said, one day I'm going to go to Africa one day. One day I'm going to meet the people. One day I'm going to have this, for us, a spiritual experience. So in the meanwhile, my dad, who was also very strong, he told me that he heard a pianist in Panama playing at a hotel. And he said this guy plays so much piano, it just moved him. And he decided in the back of his mind, when he had a child, that child was going to play the piano. And that child was me, which I didn't know. Now, when I was 12 years old, I was 6 foot tall. I had big feet. I was big. And in those days, if you were tall, you were automatically awkward. Not like today where you have these magnificent 7-footers gracefully floating over the basketball court. But at that time, You know, if you were tall, you were teased, you know, your feet are big, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I put all my emphasis on sports. I played baseball, I played football, I played basketball, and I love sports. But my dad, he wanted me to study the piano. And so he made me take piano lessons by force, like really serious by force. And I have to emphasize at this time, I was a great jazz fan. All of our young people during the time of the 78 disc, for example, when Coleman Hawkins came out with Body and Soul, I think that was 1937, 1939. That was a classic hit. It was a masterpiece of the saxophone because Coleman Hawkins, he's playing Body and Soul, but he's not playing the melody. But you can hear Body and Soul. And this recording became a big hit. Housewives were buying it. People who knew nothing about jazz was buying this record. And I was such a jazz fan of the music, loving Count Basie, loving Duke Ellington, loving Billie Holiday, loving Ella Fitzgerald, growing up in this tradition of music, you know. And I would buy 2 or 3 copies of Body and Soul. I would play one, and I would hide the other 2. So I was a big fan of the music. But to play music, I didn't realize you have to practice, and you have to go through the scales, you got to go to school, and I didn't want to deal with that. So finally, after 3 years, with this one particular piano teacher, I'll never forget her, a poor woman. She was very nice, but she suffered greatly. She used to beat my hands with the, see, in those days when you made a mistake with the piano, they'd beat your hands with a ruler. See, them teachers were, you know, they were gangsters, you know. They were serious, you know, you couldn't mess around. And she hit my hand on the ruler, I'm trying to play, I'm looking outside at the kids throwing the football and the baseball and so forth. Now, this may seem insignificant, but this is, everything I'm telling you is the base of what happened in my life and why my direction was like it was. Now, my mother was a very spiritual, very religious woman. Every Sunday, I'd have to go to the black church. The time I was this high. Now, when you go in the black church, and when those doors shut, which I found out many years later, it's like an African ritual. Although you have the English language, although you have European instruments, you have European texts, et cetera, but the spiritual power and what happens into that church is incredible because when those brothers and sisters come out of that church, they could deal with what they had to deal with the rest of the week. It was a place where they got tremendous spiritual energy through music. Now, as a child, I experienced this, and it was very uncomfortable for me because when you're little, you want to run around. You don't want to sit in one place, and they make you sit there, and I had on this bow tie. But at the same time, this was my first school lesson of music. They teach you in African traditional society, your first music lesson is when you're in your mother's womb. Those 9 months that you're inside of her, what music she listened to determines what happens to you. When you arrive on the planet, you already have picked up certain melodies and certain rhythms. And this was so almost all of the really great master musicians of our field all have gone to the black church. And I found out many years later what that was all about, which I will speak about later. So, okay, after I started playing local jobs around 17, 18 years old, playing with local groups in Brooklyn and whatnot. And then in the late 40s, I got to know Max Roach very well. And I got to know Thelonious Monk very well. As I pointed out to you before, Body and Soul was a great masterpiece for me. And I followed Coleman Hawkins religiously. I used to buy all his recordings. I'd always listen to who he had playing with him. And one night I went to 52nd Street. I was like in my early 20s. I was 3 years in World War II, in Okinawa for 1 year. We played music there too, but that's another story. I'm walking on 52nd Street, and I went to hear Coleman Hawkins, and I still had on this uniform. And I walked there, and Hawk was playing, and he had this pianist playing, you know, and this guy would just hit one note here, one note there. So I said, what is Coleman Hawkins doing with this guy? I said, he can't play the piano. You know, I said, I can play more piano than that, you know. But something made me come back. When I came back, I discovered Thelonious Monk. And the first time I heard Ruby My Dear was Coleman Hawkins playing with Monk. And when I heard Monk's piano, it was just like opening another door. When you look at the spiritual aspects of our music, which is what I want to emphasize, because in my experience in Africa has been a spiritual experience. There's not been notes and chords and changes and how many records did you sell and how big you are. It's got nothing to do with that. They bring music to the very beginning. Music, the creation of music is a spiritual base to thank nature, to thank the Creator for whatever we have. And it's a blessing, it's a communication. And out of that spiritual foundation comes us. And from that musical foundation is the sound of the universe. Because the sound of the universe is the original music. The sound of the universe has its own sound. And from that sound comes us. And it's like we, the musicians, we are simply messengers. We are messengers of the Creator. And it's like we deliver, like if you can imaginary, a postman, for example. The postman walks around, he carries letters on his back, and he goes to a house and he puts the letters in. Now he delivers the letter, but he doesn't know what's inside the envelope. So when we play the music, we don't know what's inside your envelope. So I might play a song about children in the Congo, but this gentleman, he might hear somebody hanging out in New York. And it's the magic of music is that when it hits you, and the music is right, you can take your own individual trip. So we can play the same song, and each one of you will have a different image or a different memory. And that's the beauty and the wonderful thing about music. So finally, I had the courage to go up to Monk, and I said, Mr. Monk, excuse me, you don't know me, but I heard your music, and I really would like to see you. I went by Monk's house about a month later, he invited me to come by. I walked to his house, and Nellie, who was his girlfriend at that time before they got married, she invited me in, and I walked to see Thelonious. She said, come on in, have a seat. I sat down. And he had Billie Holiday's picture in the middle of the scene. And he had a red light and a small piano. So I sat there, and maybe for 45 minutes to 1 hour, I started asking Monk all kind of questions. How do you do? Blah, 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 blah. No response. No, nothing. No answer. Nothing. So finally he said, listen to all kinds of music. That's all he said. And then he had this radio playing. This radio was playing soft music. And I wanted to leave at that particular moment, but I couldn't leave. Something kept me in that room. And I stayed in that room almost 9 hours, just sitting there. I couldn't leave. I never leave, and I couldn't leave. And Monk just sat there, just saying nothing. So finally, I got the courage to say, excuse me, Mr. Monk, but it's a little late. I think I have to leave, He said, oh, yeah, come by and see me again. And I left completely like this. Next time I went to see him, he played the piano for me about 3 hours. So what I found out, that he was checking me out, but not with the spoken word, because sometimes we feel that the only way to communicate with the spoken word, but it's not true at all. We can speak and we can communicate without even expressing one word, through the power of vibrations. And Monk was checking me out, which I didn't know. And I spent 3 years with Thelonious. Never gave me a piano lesson, but every day he gave me a piano lesson, if you know what I mean. Now, just going back pre-Monk, to let you know who my influences are on the piano. First was Count Basie. Count Basie was a master of space. On the piano, Basie knew what not to play. And believe me, it's very difficult to do. Because we're in a world of technology, we're in a world of speed. We're in a world that everything's got to be a fast tempo. Whether it's the fax, whether it's the telephone, whatever, or it's this, blah, blah, blah. Everything, telephone, airplane, everything's like this. But Basie, he had a way of just playing just a few notes. And each note for me, was like conversation. Because the early jazz men, when you took a solo, you did two things. You didn't just solo to show how much technique you had. You soloed because a solo was a new composition based under another composition, but also a solo was a conversation. And nobody demonstrated that better than the Ellington trombone section. The people like Bubba Miley and people like Tricky Sam Nathan, how they could take the trombone and actually hold a conversation. And that comes out of the West African dialects, this whole concept of music and language. So in a way, it's much more difficult to play simply than it is to run all over the keyboard, all over the saxophone, all over the trumpet. Although Mr. Charlie Parker, Mr. Dizzy Gillespie, Mr. John Coltrane, Mr. Art Tatum, they took it someplace else. But basically, I love Basie for that. He was a master of the blues. He had a fantastic orchestra. The orchestra swung and was incredible. My second influence was Nat King Cole. Most people think of Nat as a great singer, which he was a tremendous singer. But for me, Nat was one of our truly great pianists because with Nat, for me, every note was a jewel. Every single note was utter beauty when he played. The next one was Mr. Art Tatum, as Fats Waller called him God. And he was frightening. In fact, I used to go hear Tatum, and this man played so much piano, I never had the courage to shake his hand. I never had the courage to even go close to him because it seemed like to me he was from another planet. And I'm sure he was because it's impossible for anybody to play a piano like that. The next one was Thelonious Monk, who I talked about before, and then came Duke Ellington, ironically. I discovered Duke as a pianist the last, although I've been listening to Ellington all my life, but I had been listening to the Ellington Orchestra. I wasn't listening to Duke to the piano. Out of all these pianists, I guess the ones you hear more connected to Randy Weston is Thelonious Monk and Duke Ellington. And I think that's a very good reason for that. I was fascinated by their sound. Monk could get sounds out of the piano that's not there. Ellington could get sounds out of the piano that's simply not there. I didn't know how they did that. They would go to the piano and they would create these wonderful sounds. They were also great composers, also great band leaders. And they were very much into the black tradition, the African American tradition, which means you have this as your base. So Ellington could write about Shakespeare, he could write about Asia, he could write about anything in the world. But with Ellington, underneath, somehow you always heard the blues. Because the blues is always there. That wonderful simplicity. Ellington and Strayhorn could add those beautiful colors. So, just before Mr. Monk, I have to emphasize Mr. Ahmed Abdul Malik. Ahmed Abdul Malik, he was a very great bassist. He played with Thelonious Monk for a number of years, but we grew up together as kids. His father was from the Sudan. We grew up in Brooklyn together. Now, when we were kids, I'm talking about 16, 17 years old, he would take me down to the North African Arab section of Brooklyn. There's a big section there where you have people from Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, the Middle East, and whatnot. And he exposed me to instruments like the qanun, like the oud, like these ancient instruments coming out of the Middle East. So I used to try to play funny sounds with him, and we used to get thrown out of bands all the time. So I was searching for Monk even before I heard Monk. And I was searching for Duke ever before I heard Duke at the piano. So when I found them, that sort of opened the way. Because for me, these men, and we have so many. This is one problem that we have in America. We have so many greats, and it's hard to pin down. I could spend one afternoon talking about Earl Gardner. I could spend one afternoon talking about Earl Hines. I could go on and on and on. There were so many greats. But the thing is that is so important. For me, the Louis Armstrongs and the Billie Holidays and the Sarah Vaughns, and these people are like musical prophets that the Creator sent on the earth and said to us, we, the people of the planet Earth, because our only language is music, because all the other languages fail at a certain point. They fail with communication. Because if I speak one language, you speak another language, we don't understand each other. We might understand Now's the Time by Charlie Parker. See? So it's like the Creator sent these people to say, Ellington to say, you can make beautiful music this way. Billie Holiday said, you can make beautiful music this way. Earl Hines said, you can make beautiful music this way. And it goes on and on and on. Now in the jazz books, they say styles, but styles miss the boat completely. Because for me, this music comes out of a very complex, a very deep concept of civilization, which is based upon African traditional life. And before you can have a civilization, the first thing you must have a spiritual, musical base. And from this, our ancestors who were taking slaves over in boats, they brought this civilization with them. It didn't just come out of the air. The reason why jazz happened, if we had kept the drums in America, there probably wouldn't be a jazz. But the drums were taken away, so the African people, they put rhythms in the trumpets and trombones, English language, the French language, the Spanish language, the Portuguese language, drums. I've heard cats make music out of knife and forks. I've heard guys make music out of a matchbox. Because with African people, music is something that you can make music out of anything in life, anything. A table, a chair, anything you can make music out of, because music is nature itself. So with all these influence, I started to develop a way of playing, and I was very lucky in the early 60s, I finally went to Africa. Now I'm going to play for you my first piece about Africa. I wrote this piece in 1954. It's called Zulu, and it was because of the great scholar of jazz. Do any of you know about Marshall Stearns by any chance? He's written a book called The History of Jazz, or The Stories of Jazz. You have to get it. It's very important. Marshall Stearns was a white American. He was a teacher of English at Hunter College. And he was one of the first jazz scholars. I mean, really a scholar of the music. And I met him in Lenox, Massachusetts in 1950, 1951. And he was giving a lecture on the history of jazz. But he was the first person I heard start off with West African music. And he would play West African music first, and then he would go to New Orleans, Kansas City, to explain that this is a movement of African civilization in the United States, which has produced the blues, the rhythm and blues, the samba in South America, the reggae, all this music. Because if you take out the African elements, you have absolutely nothing. What is Mother Africa? Call and response. Everything we do, whether it's in the black church, whether it's a Count Basie orchestra, if you're going to play jazz, call and response is of essence. What is call and response? I say something and you respond. That means we're having a conversation together. And our music is based upon having a spiritual communication. So when you come into a jazz club, and I'm always amazed myself because I don't know what I'm going to play. When I go in that club, I don't have a clue what I'm going to play. And I know you, the audience, don't know what I'm going to play. But yet, we understand each other. Yet you see the people clapping. They feel happy. They feel good. We feel good if you feel good. And we have this wonderful, spiritual, mysterious, magical, supernatural experience. And we sit next to each other. It's like when I look at the audience, I said, you see the people here? You are now earth people. You become one. Because when you leave here, everybody's going to go to their own world, And the guy you're sitting next to, you probably would never have a communication with that person, except the music would bring us all together. So the music itself is very, very powerful and very spiritual. And the African people taught me there's no separation between religious music and secular music. They don't believe in that. It's a whole, everything comes from the Creator. So Charlie Parker is just as spiritual as any church that you can think of when you speak about music and beauty and love. Because the music is a healing force. When Charlie Parker plays, we feel happy. We feel good about ourselves. We forget about our problems. We forget about all the things that go wrong. And the music gives us inspiration. So again, I want to emphasize that's this wonderful background. I'm going to play this song for you, Zulu. And it sounds a little bit like Monk because at that time I was hanging out with Monk. Zulu. Influence of Thelonious because I was with him. This man was so wonderful. I cannot tell you, just being with him and watching him and listening with him. And I had to go back to Max Roach's house because at Max Roach's there were two cultural centers in New York, and those cultural centers were two houses actually. Max Roach's apartment. That's where I met Charlie Parker. That's where I met Dizzy Gillespie. That's where I met Leo Parker. That's where I met Miles Davis. That's where I met so many people in Max Roach's house. And I would sit there and just watch and listen, hear them discuss music. All right, now, during this period, late 40s, early 50s, the bebop music came in, which was called bebop because musicians, we never name our music. If I was to say to another musician, let's go play some jazz, it would mean like I'm crazy. We don't call our music jazz, but our music is called jazz. It's funny, isn't it? Because I was to say, hey man, let's go play some jazz, it looked at me like I'm nuts. I say, let's go play some Ellington, let's go play some Monk, let's go play some Gershwin, let's go play some... But we don't use the term. And I was very lucky to be in Max's apartment one day with Charlie Parker, Max Roach, George Russell, and Miles. And I was just sitting, watching, listening to these people talk. And they said, you know, jazz does not describe our music. So we have to find a way to describe our music. This is not the word. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't give any historical context. It doesn't give any credit to our ancestors. It's just a word that's used. And the word is used, all that jazz, jazz this, jazz me, baby, jazz. I said, well, what is this word? So we all started talking, and I was listening very intently. I said, I have to find a name for my music. What do I call this music? Finally, after a number of years, I call my music African rhythms. Why? Because my music is influenced by calypso, it's influenced by jazz, by blues, by the black church, etc., etc. But the whole base of this is Mother Africa. Finally, in 1959, and I had met Melba Liston before this, I met Melba Liston in the early 50s. it was wonderful to see this beautiful woman playing a trombone in the Dizzy Gillespie Orchestra. And when I saw her, it was just incredible. And she did an arrangement of My Reverie for Dizzy's band, and she played the solo. And I heard this beautiful sister with big sound on trombone. I said, who is that, you know? I never saw a woman play a trombone before. I never saw one who was as beautiful as she was playing in this fantastic, exciting bebop orchestra. And Dizzy had all the great musicians, because that was an incredible orchestra. So finally I met her, I shook her hand, and when I shook her hand, it was like magic, like electricity. And our careers were about to begin. Our first recording was 7 Waltzes for Children, which we did in 1958, which I wrote songs of a song for little boys, a song for little girl, song for children ice skating, songs for children climbing a hill. And that was our first collaboration. But in my mind, at the same time, for the first time, the African countries were finally getting their independence. And it was the beginning of the civil rights movement. And it's very important that to connect, the music is connected with what goes on. When we have rap music today, the reason why there's rap music today, because that's what's going on today. And the bebop music, that music that began at that particular time, described what happened after the Second World War, and what kind of energies were coming out. And at the same time, for the first time, many of the African countries were finally getting their freedom. There wasn't going to be any more Belgian Congo. There wasn't going to be any more French West Africa. There wasn't going to be a British Somaliland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the countries were getting their independence. And I decided that I wanted to create a suite of music which would describe this movement of freedom and independence. In 1959, we started working on a composition called Uhuru Africa, which is Freedom Africa in Kiswahili. I spent many weeks at the United Nations speaking to various African ambassadors, delegates, et cetera, because I wanted to find out how could I dedicate some music to the new African nations by using an African language, because there were so many languages, I think something like maybe close to 900 different languages on the continent of Africa. How could we choose one? Well, the general consensus, we would use Kiswahili, which describes the North and the South. I went to the great writer and poet Langston Hughes. I asked Langston would he kindly write a freedom poem for me. And Melville listened to the arrangements, and it was one of the greatest moments of my musical life. It took place in 1960. The rhythm section was Charlie Persip, Max Roach, Ron Carter, George DeVivier. The trumpet section was Clark Terry, Freddie Hubbard, Richard Williams. We had Julius Watkins on French horn. It was a tremendous all-star orchestra, and we recorded this piece. And it was very powerful at that particular time, because you see, in 1960, at that time, we were still called American Negroes, and that's very important. And that terminology means that you have no homeland. Like my dad said, we could never send a package back home. We used to say that. He said all the people in America could send a package back home, but we couldn't. It was very important. But at that time, that was our title. We were either called colored or we were called American Negroes. But the identification with Africa was taboo. So by us identifying with Africa and writing music about Africa, and I mean Charlie Mingus, I mean John Coltrane, I mean Sonny Rollins, there were a number of us, not just myself. But this was the spirit of what was going on. It was Martin Luther King, it was Malcolm X, it was SNCC, it was the students, it was a movement to make America a democratic country, get away from the signs, et cetera, et cetera. And the music expressed this. So I'm going to play for you now. It's called the Freedom Africa Suite. I'm going to play for you the first two movements. The first movement is called Uhuru Kwanzaa, which in Kiswahili means freedom first. And the second movement is called African Lady, and that's dedicated to the African woman, because it's the mothers and the women and the sisters who nourish us and keep us strong and keep us focused. And my mother was like that. She was a very tiny woman. Always go to church every Sunday. Had very little to say. My father was the fire of the family. But she was very steady, very spiritual. So the first movement is Uhuru Kwanzaa, and the second is African Lady. Now we had this with a 30-piece orchestra, so I'm going to attempt to do that on the piano for you, to give you the idea of what was going on at that particular time. particular time, this music was rather dramatic, was rather revolutionary. Because at that time, and going back to the history of our music, African American black entertainers, they had to dance and be clowns in many instances. The beginning of bebop was a different message entirely. So finally, the great moment happened. I was very pleased. 1961, I was chosen to go to Nigeria with 28 other artists. And some of the artists were Lionel Hampton, who had 8 members of his orchestra, Nina Simone, Langston Hughes. I took with me Booker Irvin and Clarence Stroman. Ahmed Abdul Malik was on bass, Hale Woodruff, a painter, and there were 29 of us. And we spent 10 days in Lagos, in Nigeria, to see what was the connection, what is any connection between the music, the dance, the philosophy, the way of life of West Africa, and we the African Americans. And for example, we had the 2 great jazz dancers, Al Mims and Leon James, and they would do some of the dances from the Savoy Ballroom. Then we had some traditional dance on the other side of the stage. And during the day, we would have discussions. We would discuss everything, trying to see what this connection was of West Africa and the African American. Now, after all of the concerts and after all the discussions, I used to hang out in the clubs in Lagos. And there was one club which was really wonderful. This club was called the Cabin Bamboo. And this club was owned by a Nigerian named Bobby Benson. Now, Bobby Benson was a very good drummer. He learned how to play regular stick drums, and he was with the USO bands. Came back to Nigeria and formed this wonderful club. Now, in this club, all the young West African musicians would come there, and they would come and sit in and jam and collect music of American jazz music. And in addition to that, on the weekends, he would bring in traditional music from the country. And it was a great experience just being there. And I got to feel the spirit of West Africa. I went back in 1963, myself and an illustrator and a painter named Elton Fax, and we went to the various universities in Nigeria. And I did classes about the connection between American jazz and West African music, and showing the similarities, not the differences, showing what the similarities are. Finally, in 1967, I was chosen to do a State Department tour of 14 countries in Africa, and I had a wonderful sextet. I had Clifford Jordan, tenor saxophone, and Ray Copeland on trumpet. Fisherman Wood was our bassist. Had the great Ed Blackwell on the jazz drums. Had a wonderful percussionist named Chief Bay. He played the African traditional drum. And we toured 3 months in North Africa and West Africa, and we also went to Beirut, and we took our music. So for the first time I had an opportunity, I didn't mention earlier, but from the early 50s on, I started composing many different songs about children, songs about Africa, songs about New York. I started doing a lot of composing. So this particular band was very important to me because it gave me my first opportunity to play music that I wrote about Africa, but to play for African audiences. And that was the big test, because you can dream over here, but to go there and play the music for the people and see what their reaction was going to be. Well, it was an incredible tour. One of the important things that I have to emphasize, one of the key to our success of our tour was we had the African drum with the jazz drum. So even if some of the African audiences didn't understand what we call jazz music, they could identify with the spirit of the African drum. And they were amazed to see an African traditional drum with a jazz drum. So we toured, we went to Senegal, we were in Nigeria, we went to Gabon, Cameroon, Liberia, Egypt, we went to many, many countries. And during this particular tour was a time in the 60s when the rock music started coming in, very big. And all of a sudden, the so-called jazz musician was out of favor. If you didn't put a plug in the wall, if you didn't have a synthesizer, you could not be a musician. And the poor acoustic piano was finished. It was out of date. And he said, you go into clubs and they wouldn't have pianos anymore. He said, well, where's your keyboard? So a complete change. So I said, okay, now it's my turn. Now I want to go to Africa and live. This is the moment. And each country, I was trying to decide which country I would like to live in. But when you do those State Department tours, you get red carpet treatment. So you can't really know because you meet the ambassadors and you meet the ministers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't really tell. As it turned out, Morocco was the last country. And I had to stay in Morocco about an extra week or so because when you do those State Department tours, you have to make a report of what was good, what was bad, what was positive, what was negative, what your experiences were before you can get the rest of your money. See? So I spent 1 week, with a wonderful woman who was acting as a secretary manager and prepared this report. So in the meanwhile, I met a few Moroccans. I went back to New York. I still not decided. And then I got a letter about a month later from the USIS and saying the Moroccan people have gone simply crazy about your music. They want you to come back. So I went back to Morocco and I stayed 7 years. And it was God's way for me of picking Morocco for me. It was very interesting because I spoke no French, I spoke no Arabic. And if I was going to live in a country in Africa, it would be more of an English-speaking country. But the Creator didn't intend for that to happen. It was meant for me to go to North Africa. And it was very important, too, because, number one, I learned something that we don't know about. The black people in North Africa. There's a very strong cultural force of black people in the southern part of North Africa. You find in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, and they have their music and their culture. Because in ancient days, the caravans went back and forth. They not only dealt with salt and gold and etc., but also in slaves. And it was a tremendous movement and culture and music. Finally, in 1967, I met people called the Ganawa people. The Ganawa people, they told me they are originally from ancient Egypt that migrated when Egypt was invaded from the north. Many of the Egyptians migrated. Some went from east to west and created other empires, such as Mali, Songhai, Ghana, etc. Some went further south. Some got trapped in some areas and had to survive in very difficult times, and they traveled. So they told me that they migrated from Egypt to West Africa, and they were taken as slaves and soldiers by the Arabs, and taken from West Africa to North Africa. After they got their freedom, they settled in different cities in Morocco. And when I heard their music, it was like hearing our blues, our jazz, all at the same time, and our spiritual music. And when I heard their music, it was quite a revelation for me because it was like realizing that we call ourselves the jazz people, but I say you have to go back further than that. If you really want to have an understanding of jazz music, take your time and do research on African traditional music. This is very, very important. And this music didn't just happen because people were enslaved and look up at the sky and the music just came out of nowhere. No. It came from a very complex, and I can't emphasize the complexities of African traditional music, because these complexities are built basically on the Creator, basically on life, and music for every single activity. I want to share a story with you that was told to me by a wonderful Sufi master from the Sudan. I asked him, I said, why am I so involved with African music? Why do I call my music African rhythm? What is this message I'm trying to give the world? Because what's important to realize, wherever you find African people, if you find them in Brazil, you find them in Cuba, you find them in Colombia, you find them in Puerto Rico, wherever you find these people, they create a music that brings joy and happiness. Can you imagine the United States without jazz, without blues, without rhythm and blues? It's inconceivable. But this music is a healing force. And not only that, but the music is such a powerful force that it was the only force that could bring our races of people together. Because before jazz, before this music, we could not be together. We were separated. But the music was so powerful, it overcame ignorance and oppression and brought all the people together. So it's a wonderful message. But to tell you this man's story, he said to me, he said, Africa is not the geographical area that it occupies. It's not the people that live there. It's not the Sahara Desert. It's not the rainforest. It's not the elephants. It's not the tigers. It's not the snakes. It's not. And he goes on and on. I said, well, man, what is Africa? He said, Africa is the spirits of our ancestors. He said, the whole human race began in Africa. He says, everybody on the planet Earth has African blood. He said, and when the spirits of our ancestors call us, whether we are a Norwegian in Norway, whether we are a Dane in Denmark, whether we are an Indian in South America, whether we're an African American in Brooklyn, when the spirits of our ancestors call us, we become in love with African culture, African spirituality. And this is the process. And it's really true because you see, in African traditional society, for example, the Ganawa people, I'll go back to them. In Western society, to be a master, all you have to do is play well, and that's all. Anything else you can do what you want to do. If you play well, you're considered a master. Not in African traditional society. You have to be able to play well, but you also have to be a historian. You have to be a storyteller. You have to be a healer. You have to know how to play certain music to heal people. Because they say when you become ill, you become out of tune with nature. And ancient people knew that when you become sick, because most sickness comes from here, most of our physical illnesses come from the head. So they know this. So they say when they play certain music, when you're not feeling good or you feel really bad, they play certain music, they find your sound. Because we're all walking musicians. Your heart is your drum beat and your voice is your sound. And that's the reason why we're able to communicate, because we're all musicians. And the African traditional society, they know this. Just everybody is a musician. That's why in many African societies, there's no such word as musician. It doesn't exist because everybody does it. So why have a word? There's no such word as music. Why have a word of music? Because everybody does it. You see, there's no separation. So getting back to these people, and you also have to be clean of mind and clean of spirit. Why? Because when these master musicians, when they play for people, and they have a healing ceremony, they put people in trance. And they have to know exactly what they're doing. They have to be able to play the right notes, the right rhythm, to communicate with that person. And if they don't have the right mind, they can injure that person. So the master, he must be clean of mind and clean of spirit. So to be a master, it's not so easy. So going back to the Ganawa people, I went to a ritual in Tangier, Morocco. In Tangier, you can't get much further north in Africa than Tangier. When you go to Tangier, Tangier is an international city, and you would tend to not realize that it's Africa. It is Africa, but at the same time, it's a lot of Europeans there because it was an international city for a long time. But underneath the ground, it's really Africa. And these Ganawa people is really Africa. And I went to the ceremony, and I heard and experienced 3 different colors. And people were dressed in a particular color, and they would dance until their spirit takes over to cleanse them, to bring them back to life. And I heard the color blue, and I played this piece because it's a spiritual piece. They say it's the blue of the sky and the blue of the sea, because all African music is based upon nature. And what's the connection between jazz and nature? Here's the connection. With our music, it changes just like Mother Nature changes. Mother Nature improvises every single second. One day it's sun, one day you got wind, and you got snow, then you got rain, etc., etc., etc. So Mother Nature is the master improviser. The first orchestra was Mother Nature. If you go into like I did in Gabon, when I went inside the forest, I took my tape recorder. I put my tape recorder in the forest, and I recorded the sounds of the forest. And when you play this back, you hear the Mother Nature. It was the original orchestra. Because when you play this back, you hear rhythm here, you hear rhythm here, you hear a bird call here, you hear another sound here. But when you listen to it, you listen to an orchestra. So even the whole concept of orchestra comes from Mother Nature itself. So we the jazzmen, whether we realize it or not, when you improvise, and I can't say improvise because improvise is a very delicate word. Why do I say that? You can improvise and not create. Improvise does not necessarily mean creativity. So I like to use the term spontaneous creativity. When you do that, you're in tune with Mother Nature because she's always improvising. This is key. So I want to play this piece for you, Blue Moses. I learned this piece on the piano. After I learned the piece, the chief of the Ganawa asked me not to play it because it was a spiritual piece and they wanted to keep it within the society. So after 1 year, I went to him and I said to him, his name was Fata. I went to him and I said, Fata, I said, excuse me, but I think that people in the world need to hear this music. And I talked to him and he said, okay, he gave me permission to play it. And believe me, I would not play that piece without his permission because the things about this music that I don't understand myself, it's like really a wonderful kind of magic. So I'm going to play this for you and give you an idea of what this piece sounds like. Now, I just want to talk about the instrument itself. The instrument is a 3-string instrument that they use. It's called a hajuj. Sometimes it's called a gimbri. It has 3 strings, and it's played like our ancestors played the banjo, which you have a combination of string and drum at the same time. And when they play, and this instrument is like their spiritual instrument. And with this instrument, they can play colors, they can do all kinds of things. For example, when we think about music, you ever think about games? We think about music. Now what we do, we play jazz and we play this, we play that. You ever think about games? African traditional society, they have music for certain games. They have music for when they do acrobats. They have music for every single thing. There are some societies that if you're 5 years old, you cannot become 6 years old until you learn the songs of a 6-year-old, which means you can be on the planet for 90 years. If you don't learn those songs, you'll never become 6. So I just want to emphasize how serious they are about music. And that music is our beginnings, because African music is as old as Africa itself. And the natural laws of music come from there. And that, from Mother Africa, comes us, this spirituality. How could the people who landed here like we did, with the chains and the oppression and the racism, et cetera, at the same time, create such beauty? You see, because it comes from a very beautiful spiritual base. And I think I can't emphasize too much the importance of really studying and learning the history of jazz music, because it's a history of America that very few people know about. It's the most democratic, the most beautiful history of this country is the history of jazz. Because at those times, those musicians like Louis Armstrong, people like that, they couldn't go to hotels, they couldn't go to restaurants, they could do many things. But look at the beauty they gave us. So you know that the spiritual power had to be fantastic. All right, I'm going to play the color blue for you. Then after that, if you want to ask me some questions, I'll be very happy to. I'm trying to put my life in a capsule. But the spirit of Africa has me. It caught me a long time ago. And I'm very happy about that. And wherever I go, wherever I play, I try to share this experience. So we should not be afraid, because we've gotten too much bad propaganda about the continent of Africa. Every time we see Africa, we get negative images all the time. I was a little boy in school. I used to look at the book saying Little Black Sambo. I was ashamed, you know. And when I go to see a Tarzan movie, I was ashamed, because I said, man, I look like those people. I don't want to identify with those people. But the history of music and history of African music and what has happened with this music and the joy and the love that this music has given the world. And let's just imagine if we would eliminate bossa nova, eliminate samba, eliminate reggae, calypso, Latin, jazz, blues, the black, if you take all that stuff out, man, this is a dead planet. This planet, just like the moon, is completely dead. So the whole idea is to recognize, I feel, the contributions that African people have made to world civilization. And this is my work, and this is what my music is all about. So I'm going to play for you Blue Moses, so you hear the music of the Ganawa people. anybody have any questions you want to ask me about anything? Feel free. Mary Jo, how you doing? Melody. You all right?
Instrument, yeah.
Good to see you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Traditionally, have women in Africa participated in the music in the same way that men have, or have they had different roles? Or is that changing?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry. Women in Africa,
Yes.
have they participated in music in the same way that the men have?
It all depends on where you are.
And where you were?
Yeah, it's like we, myself and a photographer, we're doing a book on the Ganawa people, of photographs. There's no book exists on these people. So now we've made about 10 trips going to different parts of Morocco. And generally speaking, the Ganawa people, usually it's all the men play. But the women make certain sounds, certain colors in the background, like a kind of wild harmony while the ceremony is going on. But before the ritual happens, the older woman, she's in charge of everything. Everything has to be exactly, she's completely in charge. No man can touch this area. So these same people, we went down to Sahara. We didn't know they were in the Sahara. A friend of mine told me we could find them. We went down to the Sahara, about 20 miles near the Algerian border. And here we found Ganawa people. The women dance with them. And the same people, but a variation on the theme. There's a tribe of people called the Gedra. These people are in a town called Goulamine, which is the southern part of Morocco. And they also dressed in blue, and they dance on their knees, but just with their hands, you know. And they have a jet black woman who plays one big drum, and that's it. So it just varies. There is no one African music. There's so much diversity. Yes.
Yes, Mr. Weston, I have a question.
Yes.
In 1962 in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity and pleasure of seeing Monk in a small, intimate jazz club. And we were assembled and waiting for the Monk, and he didn't show. His sidemen showed, and we're time into the first set, and his group started and played a couple numbers, and he wasn't around. We started stamping, we want the Monk, and so forth. Finally, he showed, and he started playing. He was playing standing up. There was no piano bench, and we cheered. We went ecstatic, and then he staggered around the stage. It was a small stage behind the bar with the bartenders, and he actually fell off the stage. In the bar, one of the bartenders caught him, embraced him, and then he ran out the door. Later on, he came back. The evening was relatively cut short. We were a happy crowd. We saw him and so forth.
Sure.
My question to you is that was that rather typical of Monk at those days? And we had thought that he was apparently very high on drugs. How would you comment on that?
It's like which came first, the chicken or the egg. I remember when the drugs came into our community. I remember that that period when musicians, they would drink a lot of whiskey, drink beer, sometimes smoke a little grass, something like that. But this heroin thing didn't exist. And I remember when it came into our community, and this said very beautiful ladies in some case passed this poison out to people, you know. And in the process of doing that, a lot of artists' behavior changed. But basically, when it comes to Monk, I think Monk has always been a very, very quiet person, and I think Monk is very sensitive. Like for me, I don't know how the club was in Philadelphia, but I know the places in New York where some of the musicians had to play. We're just horrible. We're terrible. We just had no places, no dressing room for the musicians. It'd be wintertime after they leave the stage. They'd have to go and stand up in the kitchen or stand up where there were crates of sodas like that. And so it's a combination of all these things that I think would certainly affect such artists like Charlie Parker and Monk and people like that, if they had the right places to play, I think it might have been a different story. Some way I can describe that.
Was he kind of rebelling in a sense, would you say, or just
Maybe a natural rebellion, maybe. Yeah, it's hard to tell.
It's an interesting. It was a wonderful experience.
Yes.
That I saw and heard him only once.
But I do remember because we were very active at that time, and we were very upset with the conditions for musicians. Because a jazz club is not a dressing room. I mean, even in some of the top clubs, you know, the guys get off the stage, they have to go stand in the kitchen. There was just no real respect there.
Interesting. I appreciate your mentioning that. Thank you.
Yeah, Byron?
I think that club is called the Showboat, and
Yes.
there were a lot of glasses. The
Yes,
stage
I could not remember the name
He
of
probably didn't want to. They didn't give him the respect in that club. That was the top club in Philadelphia.
Yes, it was. I was in college there.
But they didn't care. The waitresses talked all the time, and they made a lot of noise with all.
It
the
had a little
glasses.
balcony.
Yes.
I remember the Showboat too.
That was it. Yeah.
I played
It was
there.
the Showboat, yes.
Yeah, and Peps. Those are two places
And
I
Peps,
remember.
yes. Indeed.
Yeah, it's like, what can it be to be a genius like a Charlie Parker or a Monk, you know, have to play under the worst conditions? I wonder how that affects them. You know, it certainly affected those of us who didn't have their talent and their genius. Anybody else have a question?
Where do you live now?
Well, I live in Brooklyn, but now I live in Chicago right now, which means, what I mean by that is that we, the artists, home is where we are. So I'm home right now in Chicago, but I'm between Brooklyn and Africa when I can. I was in Senegal about a month ago, spent about 10 days listening to music and whatnot. But the nature of our work is that we travel. So the planet is our home.
Do you have children?
Sorry?
Do you have children?
Excuse me?
Children?
Yes, I have 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and 1 petit.
One quick question. Of many recordings, do you have perhaps some that you're partial to that you might like to tell us that if we were to go out and buy some? That,
Well, I think I could maybe speak about some that I think important, maybe historically, you know, like the Uhuru Africa, which they just re-released, which we did in 1960, which I think was one of Melba Lissa's really great arranging talents is on that particular recording. The Spirits of Our Ancestors, which is funny because at the club, everybody's bringing this CD for me to sign. And this was done like in 1990 or 91 or something like that. But that's certainly important because it's one of the last recordings of Dizzy. And Melba did the writings with Pharoah Sanders, and that was a great one. And, certainly the African cookbook earlier with Booker Irvin and Ray Copeland, I enjoy very much. You know. So those are the ones I think off the top of my head. Yeah. So is there any other
I
questions?
have a question for you. Where do you feel jazz is moving to now? Or is it? I mean, just when you hear 20-year-old players trying to play jazz who are coming up in a radically different environment than you came up.
Yeah. I think you got contradictions, you know? In one way, it looked like it's dying out. In the other way, here comes a new force of young people. So I think that, I think Dizzy said it so beautifully. They interviewed Dizzy on BBC. They showed a 2-hour documentary on Dizzy after he died. And the guy asked Dizzy, he said, which way is the music is going? He said, all the rhythms are coming together. And I think that's the answer. Yeah. It's, rhythms are definitely all coming together.
See, from listening to you for the last X amount of years, I feel that you've been incredibly successful in getting way past the notes. And I think a lot of musicians, in my estimation, don't. I mean, it's just chords and scales and technique, but it's not about a message. And I've always felt in your music that you give a tremendous amount of room to the audience to really kind of get next to you and, as you said earlier today, imagine things and, you know, trigger feelings and emotions and imagination in the audience, which is what I think music should be about.
Yes. Exactly. And the question is, what is music? That's the first thing. I mean, what is music itself, you know? And music is a sacred art. Photography is music. Architecture is music. Dance is music. Sculpture is music. But music, why we say music is a sacred art, because you can't touch it and you can't see it. It's completely invisible. I've never been able to touch music. I don't think anybody else has either. But it's the language of our planet. It's the language that brings us together. And I think it's God's way of giving us something higher than race and gender and age and weight and size, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a wonderful force. And as I said earlier, David, you know, every time I play for an audience, I'm just amazed of how they understand what we're talking about, when we ourselves don't know what's going to happen. So that's why we say God is the real musician. I'm an instrument, and the piano is another instrument. And you were in tune. When I say God, I don't mean it. I mean in the spiritual sense. I'm not speaking about any particular religion, pre-religion. Just talking about spirituality. And it's like, and when we're in tune, the Creator guides us, and we play certain notes and we improvise. For example, a good example of that is, if you asked me to play what I just played now and offered me $1 million, I couldn't do it, because there's something different I did there that I would not do again. And I think that's the beauty of our music, being so totally in tune with nature that it changes like nature itself. So it's a blessing. And I think that I always try to emphasize for people to think a little bit about music itself. You see, because there's too much emphasis to me on the individual artist. Because in Western society, this one is great, this one is not, this one, that.
Marketing.
It's okay, that's all right. But the real power is the music itself. And like I say, we are just the messengers. And as I had pointed out before, when the postman delivers that envelope, he puts it in your mailbox, but he's not supposed to know what's inside that envelope. When we deliver the music, we can't get inside your heart. And we can't experience what you experience, but you can be sure, each one of you, and especially if the music is good. I mean, it can happen when the music is bad too, but when the music is good, each one of you have your own trip. You know, so I played song, I said, well, this song means this. Yes, well, I heard this, well, I heard that. Well, that's the beauty of music.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, listening to you and listening to Train, I really get a real sense of selflessness and putting the music, above, your ego and this, that, and the other thing. I would really personally like to see more of that happening with younger players now. I mean, right now, younger players are advertising, in GQ, and they're part of this whole marketing scheme. And I think that can be very confusing to, a young musician who all of a sudden is like now a megastar, like all over, and I think can get off the music. And I think the music suffers greatly.
I totally agree with you, Dave.
I also had another question for you about Coltrane. Can you just tell us a little bit about any observations or insights when Train kind of hit the scene, how you were affected by that music, let's say in the early 60s?
Well, there was so much going on, because it was Sonny Rollins, and then came Train, and somebody said, who likes better, Sonny or Train? You had this thing going on. But it's, all I can say to you is this, that what I found, I knew John Coltrane very well, because we used to play opposite Miles Davis at the Cafe Bohemian. I used to work with a trio. Miles would have Coltrane, Cannonball, we have Philly Joe Jones, Red Garland, Al Wynton Kelly, and Paul Chambers. So we worked opposite each other every night, and I experienced Train. But the impact that impressed me is why I say that, because there was a period when I managed a record shop. I couldn't get no gigs. So I managed a record shop up in Harlem on 125th Street. And that's the same time that Ahmed Jamal came out with But Not For Me. Remember that? Okay. I was managing a record shop at that time. And we were selling Ahmad Jamal's records like this. We were buying cases. We couldn't sell too much. I mean, it's fantastic music. At the same time, John Coltrane was a big seller in the black community. And that surprised me. And I don't know why it should surprise me, but it did, because with his different sound and the things that he was reaching for, but his music was so spiritual. And I can remember seeing him later and saying, hey man, I sold a lot of your records, up in Harlem. But Train was, I think he was a perfect example of what our music is, what it's all about, what it means, what our responsibilities are as artists. And I think he tried to take it to the highest level to bring us closer to the Creator. That's about all I can say about Train.
Any other questions?
You more?
Would you take those songs that you just played today, along with the other movements, and transcribe them and put them into a book and sell them to the world?
Yeah. I think I'm supposed to do that.
I'm with this.
And get an ad in GQ too. Collect some of the money.
This is the back over here. He's only talking about the money.
Everybody wants to.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to reiterate that Randy is playing at the Jazz Showcase tonight, 9:30 and 11:30, tomorrow at 4, 8, and 10, am I correct?
Yeah.
And I would strongly urge everybody to go over there and live over there for the next 2 days.
And if you have any children under 12, they get in free at the matinee.
Awesome.
Come back soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.